When you think about trade policy, how intertwined is that with immigration policy? We got a revision of this executive order on travel today. Does one influence the other?
No, they're not really very much influenced in terms of policy. They are both affected by the same political attitudes. They're both affected by the sense among a lot of Americans that their interests are being subordinated to foreigners, both by trade and by people coming in. I think that argument has some force with regard to trade, much less with regard to immigration. I think the job displacement argument with immigration is greatly overdone. It has only a very limited area. So as I said, they're not, I don't think they're economically or technically that well connected, but they're politically intertwined.
Did you see this coming, this wave of populism that led to the U.S. declaring the TPP dead, this sort of constriction, not focusing on multilateral trade deals, but bilateral ones?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I voted against NAFTA, and I voted against the bill that allowed China to get into the WTO. I have felt for a while now, as long as I can remember, that the people making international economic policy in America were making a mistake. Partly, they were simply ignoring the negative effects that all this has on less skilled people. And it is true that trade overall enhances the gross domestic product, but the fruits of that are distributed very unequally. And there is already unequal distribution. Obviously, education has an effect, automation has an effect, but what trade does is reinforce tendencies towards increased inequality that are already there. And I have been critical since the Clinton administration of my own Democratic presidents ignoring that. And in fact, I wrote an article early in 2016 telling President Obama that he was making a mistake to push TPP without simultaneously insisting on the passage of measures that would alleviate the economic distress it would exacerbate.
Peter Navarro, the head of the White House Trade Council, spoke this morning. He talked about that relationship between exports and growth in this country. He's urging people to look more at the trade deficit. How much does that concern you, the size of that deficit right now?
The size of the deficit itself is not, I think, a huge problem. After all, the deficit does mean we've had very little inflation. That's a good thing. I mean, there was this tendency to think that, oh, it's awful, all these people are selling these things cheaply. Well, yeah, that has a negative effect to some extent, but it has a positive effect. My only problem with trade, I think the macro effects are good. The problem is it has very negative distributional effects. And there are people who say, oh, well, but trade isn't the major reason why you have increased inequality. There's also the disparity in skills that are required by this economy. I agree, but the problem is that trade reinforces those. It's a pro-cyclical policy in that regard. So no, I'm not worried about the overall deficit in terms of slowing down growth. Obviously, the fact that the rest of the world, the developed world, was growing more slowly than us was a drag on our growth. But my major concern is that, and as I said, there's an upside to imports. They help us live better. Imports, nobody is forcing Americans to import. If there's an artificial currency manipulation, that's an issue. But even there, what it means is people are sort of sacrificing their own wealth to give us goods. The problem is that the benefits from all that are distributed very unfairly.
You bring up inequality, and I wonder if it's inherently more difficult to deal with inequality when there's a multilateral deal versus a bilateral one. In other words, if you have an administration here that's going to push for more one-to-one deals, is that better for the case?
No, they're unrelated. The deals, I think the multilateral deals make sense in terms of your real relations are multilateral. You don't have just relations with one country, particularly with supply chains and everything else now internationalized. What's relevant here is, and I do not think you can solve the inequality problem within the confines of the deal. What you need are public policies that recognize that trade will exacerbate inequality, because in trade, Americans who have less skills and less education will probably get hurt compared to Americans with high skills and high education who will benefit. So what we need to do is to adopt policies in America, whether the trade deals are unilateral or bilateral or multilateral, that distribute some of the wealth better. I do think trade increases the national wealth, but it is very, very unfairly distributed. So what I want are policies that, of two sorts. First of all, that compensate the people who are clearly hurt by job loss. But secondly, we should be increasing public policies that provide quality of life measures to people. For example, as you lose your job because of trade, you're going to probably lose health care. I believe that's a strong argument for extending health care that's provided by the government. Now, I understand that this gives our poor president a headache because it's very complicated, and nobody told him that making health care for a country of 350 million people was going to be complicated, but he's going to have to get over that. And to the extent that we can provide, one of the problems now is you lose your job, you lose your health care. Your kid can't go to school. There are things we should do in public policy terms that deal with that. And I'm not talking primarily about job training. A 57-year-old factory worker, a 57-year-old coal miner probably won't become a computer programmer or a coder. But there are other jobs people can have. There are public service jobs. There are things we can do to hire people, to put them to work, drawing on their skills. And so, as I said, it's not, I don't look for the inequality to be dealt with within the confines of the deal. Recognizing that increased trade has negative distributional effects, increasing distributional negative effects that are already in the economy, we should have public policies that upset them. Now, my problem with both Obama and Clinton was they would say, we agree. Yes, there are those effects, and we are for policies that will minimize that or compensate people for them. The problem was they said, here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to get the trade bills through. Then we'll do these offsets. So here's the way it worked politically. They could get broad Republican support for doing the trade bills, and then no Republican support for offsetting the negatives. And my argument was, the open letter I wrote to President Obama last year was, make them a package. Make it clear that you will not push forward with increased trade until we have an agreement, not an agreement, a binding decision to put offsetting policies in place.
How much determinism does this president have? He's convinced here that when it comes to trade policy, he can do a lot. What's your advice to your former colleagues on Capitol Hill, members of the Democratic Party, who would like to dissuade him from doing some of what he wants to do?
Well, I don't think they want to dissuade him from some of the trade stuff, and you can't. What I think we should do is take him at his word. On a couple of points, I think Donald Trump is right at saying things that I've agreed with for a long time. The problem is he then pursues policies that are absolutely out of sync with that. I think he is right that we have been overextended militarily in the world, that people have relied on us to do too much. We've undertaken too much. And he should push ahead to have others pay more and restrain our intervention. But then he turns around and proposes an enormous military increase. Well, you don't need the military increase if you scale back to what we should be doing. Similarly, he talks about how the working people have been unfairly hurt, but then his policies in taxes and elsewhere go the other way. What I think my former colleagues should do, and I think they will do, is say, okay, you're right, Mr. President, help us support unions, increase the minimum wage. Let's make sure that people who lose their jobs don't lose their health care. I think they should say, we want to work with you. And the biggest one would be infrastructure, which could put a lot of people to work at various skill levels. And they should be willing to help him do that. The problem is that he talks in principle about doing infrastructure and has no coherent way to get it done.
We saw another executive order today, a revision to this previous executive order. There was an executive order on regulation as well, urging agencies to look at regulations that are in existence right now. What's the easiest way for him, the president, for the Republican lawmakers to do damage to the financial reforms that are in place right now? Is it through appropriations or is it more direct than that?
The Republicans have already done damage to appropriations. The worst example of that is the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. The biggest mistake American public policy made in the 80s and 90s was not to deregulate, but to not regulate in the first place innovation. And financial derivatives are the best example of that. They didn't exist 35 years ago, and then they became these enormous problems. That's AIG with its credit default swap, nearly $200 billion deficit. And that regulation of that enormously complex operation with theoretically hundreds of trillions at stake, one of the major regulators is the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Its budget is $250 million. Gary Gensler, the former chairman, pointed out the other day, I was with him, that in 1 year they brought in as much money through fines against banks that had misbehaved and other financial institutions that equaled 13 years of the appropriation. So yeah, they have used appropriations and then they complain that the regulations are coming out too slowly, but they've crippled them. The biggest issue they can do is through the reconciliation process, they will probably change, to my regret, the funding formula for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, subject it to appropriations, and then choke it off. Other than that, well, he can appoint people who won't do much. I do not think they will get any substantial legislative change through the Congress with the 60-vote requirement, except areas where there might be some agreement to give a little relief to mid-sized banks and smaller banks in ways that don't in any way undermine the regulatory framework.
How different would the CFPB be if it had a commission structure and it was under the aegis of Congress? How important is it to have the independence it has?
It would
right
be
now?
Much less well-funded. I just got to show you an example of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which is supposed to be regulating derivatives, which does regulate derivatives, and has $250 million to regulate hundreds of trillions in very complicated stuff. So clearly it would have much less money and be much less able to respond to complaints. As to a commission, it would be unable to function very well. Look at the other commissions. Part of the problem we now have, people understand that, is this terrible problem with the confirmation process. I don't think there's a commission out there that's got a full complement of people. And part of the problem, too, has been the Senate has changed its role. Traditionally, the president appointed the people to the commissions. And it's evolved so the Senate, through the confirmation process, now demands control over the commissions. The president gets to name the chair, but the other four members, they're typically five-member commissions, they really are the senator's picks, and it doesn't work well. But I think you can look at the other commissions, the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, the Security and Exchange Commission, and at best you see badly you see people don't have a quorum. There are only 3 commissioners, so 2 commissioners can't talk to each other in their offices because that would be a majority in violating the open meeting rule.
Steve Bannon has talked about the deconstruction of the administrative state. That's his objective here. That's the president's objective. How different does the regulatory environment look to you in 4 years' time?
I think it will vary. They will do some damage in the environmental area. I think within the financial regulatory area, what they'll do is appoint people who won't use it as much, who won't use the power as much, but I don't think they'll make some substantial changes. And they also are going to run into this, that regulation specifically is more popular than regulation in general. Oh, people don't like regulation, but do they really want to go back to a situation where an AIG can incur $180 billion in liabilities on credit default swaps, not know it, come to the Bush administration and say, we're $85 billion in the hole, and then a week later say, oh, we meant 170, and cause that kind of distress. So I do think as it becomes clear what the specific regulations are, there will be a lot of resistance.
Last question here about tax reform. We see movement on the Hill towards something. Paul Ryan and Kevin Brady trying to hatch a plan of their own. You see the White House working on one with Gary Cohn, the head of the NEC. Does this time look different than times in the past? Are you optimistic? Do you think that you're going to see tax reform legislation?
I'm skeptical. I mean, I think they literally have to hatch the plan. That is, they have to get it by Orrin Hatch, who's the chairman of, and I think whether they can hatch it in that sense, it's unclear. Clearly, there's tremendous difference within the Republican Party over this border tax adjustment. And I think you have the same problem you've always had. It's very easy to reduce rates in some areas. It is very hard to do away with some of the wrinkles. The big money, if you're trying to reduce rates and take away deductions, the charitable deduction, the home mortgage interest deduction. Look, if I was making a country from the start, I wouldn't have a home mortgage interest deduction. But now that you've had it all these years, it is built into people's equity. So the biggest asset a lot of people have, middle-income people, is the home. And if you take away their ability to pass on a home mortgage interest deduction to a buyer, you've devalued their assets. So I am very skeptical that they're going to find the offset. So then the question is, do they just say, oh, deficit, schmeficit? We were just kidding. I mean, look, we're already seeing some of this. They voted in 2015, both houses under Republican control, to totally repeal the health care bill. And so people have said to them now, well, why don't you just pass the bill you passed 2 years ago? And the answer is, oh, because this would be real. We only could pass that because Obama was going to veto it. We weren't serious about it. Well, I think this is, again, an issue for them. They have to be real with tax reform now, and they have to, either they raise taxes in some areas, Board of Adjustment will raise them on Walmart and others, or they will just say we don't care about the deficit. And when he's got to do $54 billion extra for military spending, and he's going to cut other things, but you never come close enough. To his credit, he does not want to cut Social Security and Medicare. I think he's right about that. I think reducing poverty among the elderly was a great thing we did, beginning in the 30s and continuing. So I guess I don't know. I don't think they're going to be able to find revenue offsets. The question is, are they prepared to say, oh, we don't care about the deficit? I don't know.
Congressman, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Welcome.
Thank you.